Okay, I'm thanking Mr. Torun. So you see how tough moderator I am. He is keeping the limits. So I think we will finish the program on time. I should also remind you there is the simultaneous translation Portuguese-English. So at the end of the panel, you can also ask your questions in Portuguese as well. So do not be ashamed, do not be shy in asking questions. As it is summarized by Mr. Torun, there are serious problems going on in the Middle East, and unfortunately, they are also affecting the state structures. So he referred to the example of Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. So we can also add to this Libya and Yemen as well. So the unfolding events in the Middle East is not only affecting the Middle East, but also increasingly affecting the international community and EU as well. So the efforts should be together to overcome these challenges. So without further ado, now I'm moving to Colonel Luis Eduardo Marquez Saraiva, if I am spelling it correctly, a researcher at Lusiada Research Center for International Policy and Security. The floor is yours. You have 15 minutes as well.
Thank you very much. I will try to spend 15 minutes or a little bit less than that. I'm going to introduce in the discussion a more generic multilateral approach to the present urgent situation. So I will not stick to the involvement of European Union and Turkey, but I will try to get to the upper level of the United Nations. And allow me to read what I prepared, my notes. The humanity is suffering a major disaster not shown since the World War II. Millions of persons are fleeing from their homes to avoid violent armed conflicts, unrest, violations, and death. This major movement that started a few years ago from south to north has been strongly aggravated by the conflict in Syria. The international community has not been able to tackle such tragic challenge. Mutual recriminations serve more to deepen the crisis than to identify solutions. On top of this disaster, some players of the international community are more acutely interested in controlling resources of the areas concerned than solving the problems caused by those same fights for the control of those resources. The world is becoming less altruistic, and the refugees are increasingly being seen as a threat and not as a needed people. What is failing in our world today? Some attribute causes of the disaster to the way some countries are playing their geopolitics in the region. Russia, and even also President Bashar al-Assad, may be using the refugees to create problems in the European Union, making the European project even more fragile and doomed to fail. The UN and several other international organizations debate and plan interventions to ameliorate the poor conditions of those expelled from their lands, but all efforts seem worthless. That is why the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon decided to promote the discussion of the issue of the refugees and the migration crisis. Some tasks are identified as a responsibility of all toward the resolution of this major crisis. But if the nations and other actors of the international scenery are not truly involved and clearly committed, then the disaster will keep growing and the consequences will become global and massive. Only with the clearly expressed goodwill will the main players be able to tackle the insecurity situations that are fueling the present global crisis. Here, European Union and Turkey can play a very relevant role if the goodwill exists. The appeal of the United Nations Secretary General concerns mainly prospects for intervention of the nations. The Agenda for Humanity of Ban Ki-moon proposes that the Istanbul Summit that takes place this year be a turning point to tackle today's challenges to humanity. It is expected that an adequate level of compromise is achieved in what concerns crises like the mass movements of refugees, that flee from zones of conflict, be it Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere. What are the new changes in the way to tackle those challenges that the Secretary General proposes? He proposes changes in the way the assistance is delivered and the way the risks and vulnerabilities are reduced. It proposes changes in the international community commitment to respecting, promoting, and implementing international law. It proposes changes in the progress needed to reach those left behind. He proposes changes in the way it is resolved the reduction of the fragmentation of international assistance that presently is materialized in greater numbers of projects and activities. And also, he proposes changes in the greater investment the international community must make to prevent and resolve conflicts and the suffering of human beings. Therefore, as remarked by Ban Ki-moon, we must act upon our individual and shared responsibilities. The Agenda for Humanity of Ban Ki-moon identifies 5 important responsibilities, what he calls core responsibilities, that have to be assumed by all actors of the international community. The first core responsibility deals with the need of global leadership to prevent and end conflicts. It is stated that an end to human suffering requires political solutions, unity of purpose and a sustained leadership, and also investment in peaceful and inclusive societies. Efforts have been made by the European Union to try to help on solutions for the tragic humanitarian crisis that have been occurring during the last years in a huge movement of people from south to north. And I'm not speaking only about the refugees resulting from the crisis in Syria, but some years before that. One of the paradigms that lately has been questioned is the idea that the North has to invest in security in the South, thus creating the conditions for the implementation of process of development. The investment in this nexus security development has not given the expected results, and so we have been watching large crowds of people trying to escape from wars, famine, and the violation of the basic human rights. A second core responsibility is identified in the Agenda for Humanity and concerns the need for supporting the norms that safeguard humanity. That means that even the laws of war have been lately at stake, and one sees new wars deliberately neglecting the rights of civilians, prisoners, wounded, etc. And that is why the United States Secretary General asks the players of the international community to respect and protect civilians and civilian objects during armed conflicts, to ensure full access to and protection of the humanitarian and medical missions, and to immediately report on violations on humanitarian law. The political actors and others actors on the terrain should also take concrete steps to improve compliance and accountability of all parties of armed conflict, and, I quote, support a global campaign to affirm the norms that safeguard humanity, end quote. The United Nations Secretary General refers a third core responsibility concerning the ideal of letting no one behind, that is, reaching everyone in situations of conflict, disasters, vulnerability, and risk. The international community must increase their efforts to reduce and address displacement, must address migrants' vulnerabilities and provide more regular and lawful opportunities for migration, must end the statelessness in the next 10 years, must empower and protect women and girls, must eliminate gaps in education for children, adolescents, and youth, an effort that Turkey already has taken, as we heard this morning, and enable them to be agents of positive transformation And also, the international community must address other groups or minorities in crisis settings. There is a third responsibility. The core responsibility number 4 underlines the need to change people's life, as referred from delivering aid to ending need. To achieve this goal, it is required the reinforcement of local systems, mainly through the following ways: to reinforce, not replace, national and local systems, to anticipate crises and not just wait for them to happen, to deliver collective outcomes, therefore transcending humanitarian development divides. Finally, the core responsibility 5 assigns a due importance to invest in humanity. This means that if all actors of the international community accept and act in accordance with sharing responsibilities for humanity, then it is required that investment is made in the political, institutional, and also financial areas. This type of investment is to be made in local capacities, in accordance with risk, and investment in stability. The financing is to be in outcomes, not fragmentation, meaning that the commitment must be to finance collective outcomes rather than individual projects and activities of local agents, non-governmental organizations, and so on. The base of the resources must be diversified and increase cost efficiency. These 5 core responsibilities that I referred are to be clearly assumed by everybody, from states to non-governmental organizations, to local leaders, and so on. Some final notes. What will happen if the nations are not involved in the solution for the present humanitarian disasters? If the nations and other actors of the international scenery are not truly deeply involved and clearly committed, then the present humanitarian disaster will keep growing and the consequences will become global and massive if they are not that yet. The goodwill of the main players, clearly expressed, is the only way to tackle the insecurity situations that are fueling the present global crisis. What we are witnessing is a new urgency concerning the responsibility to protect all human beings. The rising of a humanitarian disaster, which can grow to become global, is calling for an urgent intervention of the international community that has to act as one. Today, refugees from Syria and Iraq arrived in Portugal in the pursuit of a better life. Also today, in Brussels, a summit in the form of a working lunch gathers the EU members with Turkey. This special summit foresees to push forward a deal aimed at finding solutions for the flow of migrants, the way we call migrants, the refugees in Europe, into Europe. May this day help alert the minds of everyone for the emergency need of rapid and sound initiatives to solve this tragedy of the humanity. The Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul this year is a very good opportunity for Turkey and the countries of the European Union to define a common approach to be submitted for approval by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and also to contribute to proposals of intervention to be discussed at the Security Council of the United Nations. Thank you very much. I complied.